Our next speaker is someone who's been an inspiration to people in the movement from the very word go, someone who's informed us all on, at a deep level about the imperialist project, someone who's written a whole number of extremely useful books, as well as giving speech after speech up and down the country. He's written a book called The Obama Syndrome, which is one of a dissection of the sense of betrayal that people have felt by the new presidency. His name's Tariq Ali. Give him a warm welcome.
Friends, Lindsay referred to General Gordon and the loss of his life in Khartoum, trying to put down what in today's language would be called a Muslim terrorist uprising, led in fact by a religious leader, the Mahdi, who was fighting for the liberation of his country from British imperialism. And when General Gordon was martyred, William Morris, the great socialist and thinker in this country, wrote in his newspaper publicly, "I felt a sense of relief that an imperial chief and an imperial army had been defeated, and my full support and solidarity was to the people of Sudan and those fighting for them." In other words, why I start with this point is that people whose armies are fighting in other countries have no right to determine the leadership of the struggle in those countries that is fighting these armies. That is not our job. That is not the job of people in imperial countries. Obviously, we would all like to have National Liberation Front armies like the Vietnamese. You didn't get them before the Vietnamese, you haven't had them since. And to use that as an excuse, as some formerly in the anti-war movement do, to say we can't support these struggles is unacceptable. The second point which needs to be made is that one of the most important things the Stop the War Coalition and the anti-war movement, I remember we weren't this coalition then, but some of the people in this room will remember when we organized a meeting the very week of 9/11. That very week in Friends Meeting House, to explain what was going on, to say how this would be used, and to stand firm. And again I bring that up, is every time a new imperial war is waged in the name of so-called humanitarianism, a few more people peel away. And it happened with Libya. Now, most of us, many of us here and elsewhere, have no time for the regime in Libya. But the task of removing that regime, as we argued in the case of Iraq, our position has been consistent, is the task of removing these regimes is the task of the people in those countries. And sometimes they win, sometimes the people win, and sometimes they lose. Unfortunately, that's the way of the world. When we lost, when people we supported lost the battle, we didn't sort of say in the 60s or 70s that the Chinese should invade Indonesia, where nearly 2 million communists had been wiped out by a CIA coup. No one said it, or the Soviet Union. No one argued like that, because we know that defeats are possible. The notion that these defeats can be made into victories by imperial intervention is a total and complete farce, as we are watching today in Libya, which is why I notice very few people are calling for a military intervention in Syria. The Syrian opposition is not calling for it, to my knowledge. The last time I spoke to some of them, no, we don't want foreign intervention. The Yemenis are not calling for it. The Bahraini people didn't call for a foreign intervention, but they got it. And no one talked about it again. Pogroms took place in Bahrain as the Saudi army and its mercenaries went into Shia quarters and dragged them out. And this was a movement which began in the square in Bahrain, chanting, neither Sunni nor Shia, we are Bahrainis, we are Bahrainis. Who sectarianized the conflict? The Saudis with the green light given to them by the West. That's what happened. So on one thing, our movement has been very firm: no, under any circumstances, to imperial interventions anywhere in the world. And we know how images are manipulated. What is done? We should have realized that, how they did it in Kosovo. People get worked up. We are all human beings. No one likes people being killed. We don't either. But that is one thing. You then have to think of other ways to help people. Not to call on Western armies to go in, whether it's Iran or whether it's Libya or whether it's any other country. Can't be done like that, and it never works like that, because it disrupts the organic flow of a popular movement with its victories and its defeats. Now, I want to make 2 points about Afghanistan. One is that this war has been going on for decades and decades, and the Afghan people have not known any peace now for longer than the First World War and the Second World War and the Vietnam War. And no people on this stealth attack on them, on the British encampment, in the cover of darkness. And they were outraged by what they called the treachery. The guerrilla attack cost the British Indian Army 40 officers and men, as well as many horses and pack animals. Winston Churchill was there as a young subaltern. And he writes that, to his great delight, the commander of the operation, just wait for his name, Sir Bindon Blood, Sir Bindon Blood ordered an immediate retaliation. Churchill joined General Jeffreys in the punitive expedition to chastise the truculent assailants. But interestingly enough, what Churchill wrote still applies today with different technology. But he was, an honest, straightforward imperialist. He made no bones about it or didn't try and cover it up with bullshit language. He said the chastisement was to take the form of marching up their valley, which is a cul-de-sac, to its extreme point, destroying all the crops, breaking the reservoirs of water, blowing up as many forts as time permitted, and shooting anyone who obstructed the process. Very clear, very simple. What has changed is the technology and the rhetoric. Helicopter gunships, drones instead of bayonet rifles. Humanitarian explanations and lies instead of Churchill's straightforwardness. It was a colonial operation, pretty classic one, as these are. Have no doubt about it. When I wrote my book on Iraq, people said it's a bit exaggerated to call it the recolonization of Iraq, but what the hell was it? What the hell was it? Who now controls Iraqi oil? Who is now sitting in Iraq? And here again people said, oh well, at least they've had elections. Well, Hitler could have organized an election in occupied France during the Second World War. Would that have been acceptable too? When you have countries occupied, what do elections mean? Secondly, this war has now reached a stage which is very critical. It's critical strategically and it's critical politically. The reason it's critical strategically is that Obama's decision to expand the war into Pakistan, to violate that country's sovereignty, weak though it always has been, in public, in a way to humiliate that country's military, is now created a critical situation in Pakistan. And if it carries on like this, I mean, taking out Osama, as they put it in their vulgarly based language, was one thing. But if these drone attacks are carrying on, if Obama is going to do what he's threatened to do, which is to target other people in Pakistan who they regard as terrorists, you will then split the Pakistani military. Have no doubt about that. And I say this very carefully, because the week they went and assassinated Osama bin Laden, as Tony said, on a mission of state terror, the week they did that, there was a meeting of corps commanders in Pakistan, the top military chiefs of the country. And the military high command, led by General Kiani, had a very hard time keeping some of the younger generals in order, because they said all the backlash we are getting from army messes and the barracks is horror that this has actually happened and that we've let it happen. So you had 2 weeks after that an assault on a naval base in Karachi, the largest city in the country. And the spin that was put out, Al-Qaeda, everything's Al-Qaeda. One day the intelligence services say it's got maximum of 1,000 to 2,000 members. When it suits them, it's carrying out attacks all over the globe. Let's not fall for that nonsense. This was an attack carried out by naval ratings, members of the Pakistan Navy, to protest against the imprisonment of naval officers, many of whom had protested Pakistan's continued dependence on the Americans and the backing for the war in Afghanistan. That is what is going on. Now, a civil war in Pakistan is the last thing that country needs or anyone else needs. It's a bad situation there. And the constant threat which the United States puts on the Pakistani military is, unless you do exactly what we say, we take away your nuclear weapons. Well, you do that, if the Americans were to do that, that would be civil war immediately. And not just civil war, but many young officers say, we'll then take off our uniforms if we have to and join the fight in Afghanistan. So all this is going on at the same time, as the fact that the war in Afghanistan is going badly. Regions in the northern part of Pakistan, which have not been affected as much as the south, are out on the streets because of the killings of deaths of civilians. The puppet leader of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, has said in public, if the Americans carry on killing more civilians, people will stop seeing this as liberation and think of it as an occupation. When people like that begin to say this, it tells you how serious the situation is. At the same time, the United States are negotiating behind the scenes non-stop with people from the Taliban, both directly and via the Pakistani military intelligence, to say, what sort of deal are you offering us? What can we do? So these people who've been vilified more than virtually any other political current in my memory are now fine to talk to. That is what is going on. Meanwhile, sitting in a large country not far from Afghanistan on its borders in China, are noticing all these military bases being put up in former Soviet Central Asia and in China, and they're asking why? Why? What are these bases for? And recently, when a Chinese admiral went to the Pentagon on a friendly visit, they confronted him and said, China's producing stealth bombers. Why? And the Chinese admiral laughed. He actually laughed, the report said, and said, we are just doing them to defend our country. You tell us why you're doing them. Why have you got so many stealth bombers? Why is your military capacity greater than that of the 10 next countries, including ours, put together? How do we threaten you? And the discussion then calmed down a bit. But it's a grim prospect there unless they pull out. That is the only option they have, to pull out. They can't win this war. I mean, there are 2 new books out. just this week, over the last 4 months, on the Russians in Afghanistan, based exclusively on former Soviet archives, and they are fascinating. Fascinating, because the members of the Politburo who opposed going into Afghanistan were totally proved right. Andropov, the head of the KGB, then and subsequently First Secretary, said, I'm opposed to going in his words, because this is out of control. The people we have there are utterly useless. They didn't make a revolution like the Cubans did. Essentially what they did was carry out a military coup, and the minute we send ground troops, which these guys are demanding, we will be engaged in a war against the people. And to hear some of the reports, diaries written by Soviet soldiers, I hate to say this, but they're no different from what the Americans are saying now. And both these books show what happens when a large state intervenes. The Russians realized it after 10 awful years and pulled out. And it's the 10th anniversary of the American war in Afghanistan and that of its vassal states. And it's time that they pulled out too. And so I think what is being said from this platform in terms of organizing the largest possible gathering in central London for the 10th anniversary of this war becomes crucial. And we have to make sure that we can get as many people out, because the biggest demonstrations against the war in Afghanistan took place here, by the way. I have to say that to you. There were smaller ones elsewhere. Very little in the US. Against Afghanistan, not Iraq. Not Iraq, which were huge everywhere. The largest demonstration took place in Britain. We had 10,000 to 12,000 people in Trafalgar Square for the first of the demonstrations. I think probably more. And there was a huge turnout because people resented this, and we've now got to try and double that turnout, if not triple it, to show that we told you 10 years ago that this was a disastrous war which could never be won, and we've been proved right. This is the number of people in Afghanistan who've died. This is what the war is costing us. And it's time to pull out. And we have got to try and organize it in the broadest possible way, including supporters from the labor movement and wherever we can get hold of them. It is appalling that one of the tasks of a new labor leader elected after an electoral defeat is to fly and go and stand with the troops and support this war. And this is one reason why you have a big upsurge in Europe now. You talk to the kids in the squares in Spain and in Greece, where I go a lot to both these countries, and the big complaint is no one represents us in Parliament. This is our view. We hate the economic policies of both the centre-right and the centre-left parties. We hate the wars there, but no one defends our positions in Parliament. And in order to make their voices heard, they occupied the squares. Constitution Square in Athens, Puerto del Sol in Madrid, to make this clear. And they said we had been inspired by what the Arab people have been able to do. And so our solidarity, both with the anti-war movement and the Arab peoples, and our friends and comrades in Europe now, marching against war and marching against social injustices, has to be there in force in September this year to show that we are with them.